If it can be clearly demonstrated that no single living creature contains a trait that its ancestors did not possess, such as a new limb, organ, sensory ability, or similar clearly new traits over its provable ancestors, and are not repeated or altered versions of old traits, since evolution cannot work unless new traits emerged to increase a single living cell to something the size and complexity of an elephant, then it can reasonably be concluded that the variations of traits across the various species of all life forms are not the result of increased genetic complexity by way of evolution, but rather the result of active creation by way of intelligent design. If my reasoning be true, then animals and plants alive today should logically be in a state of entropy from the original creation. That is to say, animals were created as distinct and varied kinds by a designer in their full complexity, rather than through a process of evolution, and have since been losing the fullness of those traits, not gaining new ones. It is important, therefore, to determine what a kind is, and where and how it can be applied. If evolution be true, the word kind has no significance, as there would be no clear distinctions between when one animal became another kind of animal beyond our superficial labels. However, if my theory be true, that by active creation all animals and plants were made varied and distinct by supernatural creation, then a kind is the original prototype, or the first ancestor of a family line. Going against conventional evolutionary thought, a lion, a tiger, a cheetah, and a leopard are all clearly cats, but they do not necessarily belong to the same kind. That is to say, even though they share common design and might even be able to interbreed, they might very well have a separate ancestry. If it can be demonstrated that no animal or plant within its kind, as defined, presently living contains any trait that cannot be found within its provable ancestral history, then evolution can be falsified. That is to entertain the idea that my hypothesis is true, and treat each animal as distinct with its own ancestral past, and are not the result of common ancestry. Once again, when speaking of traits, it must be as defined as in the first paragraph, which excludes detrimental or adaptively beneficial mutations which are strictly situational and not long-lasting, example, the Darwin finches and their beaks. Such mutations only alter and modify traits that already existed in the past without actually introducing a new trait. It is not disputed that individual traits that already existed can indeed change, such as fur becoming thicker or thinner for adaptational purposes through natural selection. But as stated before, we need to see new traits emerging that the ancestors did not possess, not alterations of what the ancestors had. Such alterations can be understood to be part of the way life itself was originally designed, with the ability to adapt and change certain traits within strict limitations, a bird growing larger and smaller beaks according to season, but not growing gills or the ability to spin a web. When properly demonstrated by comparing living animals by this standard, this would undeniably prove that the types of changes evolution theory requires to bypass the distinct families of animals, mammals, and reptiles from one to another is a physical impossibility, both in the present and the past, as no living creature alive today would therefore show any signs of gradual change to any of its traits, or the addition of new ones, that can be classified as being the precursors to an active evolution into another kind of animal by introduction of new traits, not simply multiplying or subtracting or otherwise altering old traits. The mutations witnessed today have never been shown to introduce new features such as an animal growing wings, or the beginnings of such an ability, where its ancestors did not possess such a trait. It is therefore possible to conclude with absolute certainty, based on the line of reasoning, that the variations of animals and plants throughout the world living today are not the result of evolution, the act of increased genetic and physical additions and or traits that any given ancestor did not possess, but rather the survival of the offspring of an original prototype. Should evolution theory be true, we would expect at very least one single animal or plant to show clear signs of development of new traits from its likewise kind, a bird, for example, that has something no other bird from its ancestral history has. However, to assume just because two birds are radically different, for example a penguin and a woodpecker, and conclude based upon their differences that they must have evolved from a common ancestor, is a bias and cannot be used as evidence of evolution. The penguin and the woodpecker do not necessarily have a common ancestor. If by way of evidence it cannot be proven that these two birds share a common ancestor, or a similar situation between two other closely designed plants or animals, and if these two birds only have traits that can be found in its provable ancestral history, compounded by the lack of new developing traits, it is therefore possible to conclude with certainty that these two animals, while both birds, do not share common ancestry, and therefore were created separately and did not evolve one from the other. And this is the most important part of my hypothesis. If it be true, there should be a sore thumb among many different varying families of animals that show no common ancestry, thereby proving supernatural creation as the only logical explanation for their sudden appearance. This line of reasoning goes for every single animal and plant on the planet. Should no single trait be found to have been added or is in the process of being added within the provable ancestral line of either the penguin, woodpecker, or any animal or plant, or common ancestry for a single species among its family, this means the radical difference we see within a family, such as within the tree family, for example a maple tree and a palm tree, are most obviously surviving remnants of the original creative design, which was created with diversity from the beginning and has survived until today as a separate kind, and are not the result of an evolutionary history or a common ancestry. It is therefore also useless to use the fossil record in this demonstration, because it cannot be clearly shown that two similar animals that are radically different by way of distinct traits, example a Tyrannosaurus rex and a Brontosaurus, shared a common ancestor and are therefore the same kind. It is also useless to show that the difference between living creatures, such as a house cat and a lion, who exhibit slight alterations of features like the lion's mane, without being able to prove a house cat and a lion share a common ancestor. If my theory be true, the cat family, along with all other kinds of animals and plants, were created diversified originally, and they have maintained through survival of these separate species many of their individual characteristics, without becoming a new kind of animal or plant, while remaining the kind of animal they were originally created to be, with the possibility of interbreeding, thus introducing traits that may be new for a species or kind, but not for the overall family. That is to say, a tiger may never have had a lion's mane in its history, but through interbreeding would gain one. However, this is not evolution. This is the mixing of traits that already existed previously in the lion's ancestral history and potentially was created in the beginning with the trait. It cannot therefore be demonstrated where the trait of the mane itself originated and therefore cannot be said to be evolution. To further elaborate, the theory of evolution states that simple life increased in genetic material and complexity, thereby introducing new organs, functionality, design, and intelligence. A supporter of evolution would claim evolution takes too long to see any of these traits I am describing emerge. This objection is simply not fair. It does not explain why not a single animal or plant living today exhibits any single clearly identifiable addition of traits, or the process of adding one that would otherwise be defined as an event potentially leading to the kinds of radical changes evolution theory needs to be possible, or simply be inarguably the beginning of such transformation or new trait as defined originally. It must be noted that any and all assumptions must not be made concerning what is related and what is not, even if it looks very similar, like a lion and a tiger, but when provoking the idea that animals and plants were supernaturally created instead of evolved naturally, without the bias that evolution theory imposes on the natural world, we cannot so quickly determine what is related on an ancestral level and what is not. Therefore, when comparing two species of animals that are not clearly the same kind, such as a donkey and a zebra, to assume they share a common ancestor is an error simply because they share common design. Even if the zebra had a new organ, or in this case a stripe pattern that the other horses do not, this is not evidence of the fact that zebras and donkeys shared a common ancestor and that the zebras evolved. While they are similar in design and can potentially interbreed, they do not necessarily share a common ancestor and were potentially created as different prototypes, kinds, to begin with. To falsify this claim, it must be clearly demonstrated that the zebra and the donkey share a common ancestor as opposed to a common designer who created them separately and slightly differently, and that not only did the zebra gain its stripes through mutation, but that no other explanation exists whereby the zebra and the donkey could logically be so different, yet similar. Evolutionists are guilty of assuming all horses, donkeys, zebras share a common ancestor for their bias against the possibility of a designer who made the horse kind diversified to begin with. To falsify these claims, again, it must be demonstrated that a zebra and a donkey share a common ancestor, and that by the introduction of new traits they diversified, as opposed to the possibility that the two were never related to begin with and were created differently, yet with many similarities, being the same family or design of animal, a horse, with the ability to interbreed. In the event that the donkey and the zebra do have a common ancestor, that still does not prove evolution, for the minor changes between a zebra and a donkey may very well be attributed to natural selection, mutation, and adaptation, not evolution, despite the claim that evolution works on these principles. To prove evolution, it must be demonstrated that two creatures of the same ancestral line exhibit differences that were not present during its ancestry. In other words, gained traits its ancestors did not possess, beyond any reasonable doubt, and the fossil record is inadequate at this point. It must be proven by way of hard evidence on living plants or animals or recently deceased ones that an animal or plant with a clear and distinct ancestry, not speculation or lining up fossils to create fantastical, unverifiable stories, possesses a trait or is developing a trait that it did not possess in its ancestry. Should such an animal or plant be found, it must also be shown that on a genetic level the traits it is now developing are not dormant genes expressing themselves due to adaptation, mutation, or natural selection that its ancestors possessed previously. In order for the trait to be considered new, thereby verifying evolution, the trait cannot be the result of anything from the past, which can simply be understood to be a capability it was programmed with from its original design. For example, for those who claim that a bacteria becoming able to digest nylon is proof of evolution, this is simply dishonest. The digestive capabilities of bacteria can indeed be changed, as can many traits within all kinds of plants and animals that already exist, which is easily understood as an ability that life was designed with. The problem is that those who use such arguments believe that bacteria do not originally possess the capability to change their digestive abilities without attributing such a micro-level alteration to how bacteria themselves are designed to be able to adapt. This gross error extends to all forms of animals and plants, and this bias too must be set aside. It is unfortunate that YouTube has an 11-minute video limit, so I have prepared my final slides in 5-second intervals for you to rewind and pause and read at your own leisure. I thank you for listening to how I have falsified evolution, and I look forward to removing evolution from the public schools within our lifetime.